Happy New Year!
Happy New Year!
Woo! We're back. Shrink Tank Live. I have not been here since the first episode, but they actually asked me back here. Ian,
What?
Believe it or not. Yes, I didn't think I was going to make it. I think the Rooney Rule may have helped me come back, which is one of our topics today. We'll discuss that. So I'm Tarik Sloussi, and this is...
I'm Ian Murray.
Just a little bit about us.
Yeah.
Ian, why don't you start off, introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a therapist here at Southeast Psych. Work with teens and kids. Have passion for sports. So, my buddy Tarik.
Yep. Same here. I also work exclusively with adolescent and young adult guys. A variety of presenting problems: anxiety, depression, grief, trauma. So that's a little bit about us as far as mental health professionals. We're going to approach these topics. Ian's going to tell us a little bit about the topics that we're going to hit today. We're going to try to give a little bit of psychological angle to those, since we're both mental health professionals, both master's level licensed professional counselors. So without further ado, Ian, tell us a little bit about the subjects or the topics that we're going to hit today, and then we'll jump right in.
Yeah, so we're looking to have some fun with this. We've got a variety of topics. So as 2020 started, one of the biggest things that happened was the Golden Globes. So it's the first award show of the year, so we're going to start talking about the Golden Globes.
There's a lot of controversy there from what I saw.
A lot of stuff.
I had to watch the monologue yesterday again just to pick it apart a little bit.
See what the reaction was.
Yeah.
So we're gonna take that apart. We're also gonna look at some of the news in the NFL. So as we're getting into the playoffs and the regular season ends, a lot of times what happens is at the end, coaches get fired and then there's hiring, and so there's all these changes. And we're gonna look at, as Tarik referred to earlier, the Rooney Rule. We'll explain much more about what that is and why it's such a big deal right now.
Specifically relating to the Giants hiring, the New York Giants, and their hiring of a 38-year-old wide receiver coach from the Patriots. So we'll talk about that and the Rooney Rule and all of that.
Absolutely. And then the last thing we're going to cover is this idea of the World War III.
There you go.
But in the context of memes. Right?
Yes,
so I think we're going to take a unique approach to that in the way that young people are really trying to figure out how to have an opinion or talk about it or be a part of it. So we're going to have some fun with these topics. So let's get started, man.
Yeah, let's start it off. So I will be honest, I did not watch the Golden Globes. I did, for this show, watch the monologue and kind of see some of the highlights on YouTube. So invested about 30 minutes on YouTube yesterday and got all the information I need. So considered an expert. But did you watch the Golden Globes, Ian?
So I made it for about 20 minutes, went back and watched it last night, and Courtney and I, my wife, sat down and we watched it, and I got through the monologue, started to see some of the presentations, and felt like I got what I needed, and I was like, okay, I'm ready to talk about this.
Good. So what was your take? There's a lot of mixed feelings about the host and what he had to say during his monologue. What's his name again?
Ricky Gervais. So one of the things that was really interesting to me is the reaction of people. So for those of you who haven't seen it, Ricky Gervais made a particular joke about a license plate, and the camera immediately panned to Tom Hanks and his reaction. And it's going back to meme culture, it's a meme all over the internet. And so what was really interesting to me was, in this time of political correct, this PC culture, is Ricky Gervais really seemed to be trying to push back against that. And the reaction in the crowd at times really seemed to show that he was doing it to some extent. And so the reaction has been really mixed on, what boundaries did he push? Did he go over the line? Right? And so I think it was really interesting to see him try and push back when comedians over the last 2 or 3 years have been really taking strong hits to their careers for jokes that are deemed inappropriate, insensitive. It was really interesting to watch him try and walk that line.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because he even references Kevin Hart and how his career was impacted as a result of the Oscars, but that was prior to him ever being on the stage. So neither here nor there. But I go back to one of our colleagues, Dave Verhagen. He talks about the psychology of humor, right? So kind of giving the psychology angle here. And for something to be funny, it has to be a violation, but it has to be somewhat benign as well. So to me, I feel like my sense of humor, I have some pretty dark humor, and I think that's probably a product of the work I do and the clients that I work with. A lot of the adolescents and meme culture, like dark humor is a thing, and it's if you can see it as benign, which I do, I think words, and I know words have power, I know that for sure, but in the context of a meme and in a context of challenging status quos, like they're harmless. So to me, I can find humor in inappropriateness from time to time. So it was ironic for me sitting there watching this, expecting more vulgarness, to be honest, because it's a comedian. So when I think a comedian, that's what I associate with it. Maybe that's just me, but that was kind of my take on it. But from the psychological angle, the psychology of humor is, for something to be funny, it has to be a violation in some way, shape, or form, but it also has to be benign to some extent. No one's getting hurt as a result of it. So.
Right. And one of the things that's really interesting is this idea of our like immediate reaction to jokes, right? We are now more than ever able to react immediately without thinking through, right? That initial response to a joke is like almost purely emotional. So it's the first thing that we may not realize that we have a bias towards or whatever it may be, comes right out, and then not only can we talk about it, but now we can put it in writing, and we can, go after or challenge people in a way that we haven't been able to before. And so I think that's really interesting, is once we've taken a step back, because from the articles that I've looked at, the reaction has seemed to slow down.
Yes.
And I find that fascinating, of how our initial reaction is almost wanting to create it into something that isn't benign, right? Yeah. Getting these reactions. Tom Hanks' face is just like that epitome of that immediate reaction. Yeah. And now that we're taking a step back from it, it's kind of like, I'm with you.
I think going back to the psychological angle as well, what you're speaking to is a lot of what you and I teach young men that we work with. Is the emotional regulation, is the impulse control. And yes, we will be reactive at times, especially when we're in an emotional state, but we have to learn to not be reactive. But to your point, with our setup, with Twitter fingers and just the availability of sharing your opinion immediately, sometimes it's all about pausing. That's what we teach clients with emotional regulation, whether it's anger management or ADHD. It's giving it just a little bit of time, and the time is what allows you to think more clearly, because frontal lobe gets flipped and it's all emotional brain. That's right. So you got to bring it back down. So that's an interesting angle on all of that. But anything else about Golden Globes? Ricky,
I enjoyed them. I enjoyed the monologue. I thought it was funny. I particularly enjoyed him ending with "Come up, say what you need to say."
Yes.
And then get off the stage.
I think that was the most triggering statement from what I read. Is everyone was really upset with that piece, because it's you're trying to muzzle people or whatever it may be.
Right.
But I also found that interesting, because I felt I didn't see it as general as it was portrayed. I saw him share that right after he talked about Apple, and then used like the big corporations and basically challenging them to say, like, put your money where your mouth is. Like, you guys are not morally and ethical. You guys have sweatshops, and then you want to say, oh, these big wonderful things about the world and how we need to be a better place. So neither here nor there. But
I think it's a good point. Yeah. So all in all, it seemed to go over. I mean, pretty non-controversial.
People were talking about it, so I think that it did is job. Yeah. So good stuff. So let's shift to our next subject.
Yeah.
Why don't you get us started there? We'll talk about the New York Giants, the Rooney Rule. Let me first
let's give some context.
Let's give some context. So the Rooney Rule, got my notes here. Thank you, Brandon, our researcher and producer and executive. He's still figuring out his title, but we'll get that done.
Modify it.
So the Rooney Rule is an NFL policy that requires league teams to interview ethnic minority candidates for head coaching and senior football operation jobs. So some people kind of relate it to like affirmative action in some regards, but it's not required to hire, just required to at least interview. So tell us why we're bringing that up, in what context, what's going on.
Why all of a sudden, right?
So why are we talking about
that? Earlier this week, there was a hire by the New York Giants. They hired Joe Judge, who is, as you said, a 38-year-old wide receiver coach. He is a young, up-and-coming white guy who's coached under Bill Belichick. Yep. And so what's happened is there's been a lot of reaction and pushback to this hire, and we're going to get into why. But this rule was established in 2003.
Yes.
Right? And so it's been around for a long time. And I think one of the most important things about this hiring is, to my knowledge, that the Giants followed the Rooney Rule. Right? I haven't heard anything that they haven't, they didn't interview minorities, or they didn't interview people with ethnic diversity. But the reality is, what happens? They're hiring a younger white guy who,
and arguably less qualified, and that's the piece that is being argued, is that minority individuals are not given jobs when they're more qualified than their white counterparts, so to say.
Right. There's been a lot of saying of, like, for in particular black coaches have to go through these hoops and stepping stones. You got to start here and you got to work your way up and you got to pay your dues. And then, Sean McVay is a good example of this. Not that he's not talented, but, we see these young white guys and, there's something special about him. There's something different about him, and it seems to bypass that, and there's a problem with that.
Just kind of to give it a little angle from a psychology angle, I think there's a lot of implicit bias that comes with this also, and I was doing some reading, and I was watching ESPN, and Max Kellerman on ESPN was talking about how the implicit bias side of things and how African-American coaches, if they're given a leadership role within an organization, it's normally a defensive position or defensive coordinator. And it's like, what are we associating with minority men? Are we assuming that they're aggressive and some of the implicit bias, so therefore they can run a strong defense? But anything that takes brains, and it's the same thing with the black quarterback, I believe, is a little bit of that implicit bias. He's athletic, he's strong, but like he can't be smart.
Right.
Which takes me, again, let me take the angle a little bit. We'll come back to the Giants, but takes me to the angle of psychology. And believe it or not, got another note here. There was a test that was created in 1972 by Robert Lee Williams II, who was a professor of psychology and African American studies at Washington University in St. Louis. He developed a test called the BITCH test. And yes, you heard me correctly. It's an acronym. And what it stands for is the Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. And basically what that test did was it was a test that consisted of multiple choice questions in which the examinee was asked to identify the meaning of 100 words as they were then used in black communities. So it was a test that was tailored towards minority populations, specifically African Americans. And what they did is they had 100 African American boys take this test and 100 Caucasian women and men, actually, not just, or girls and boys, not just boys. And what they found is that on average, African Americans got an 87% on it, and on average, Caucasians got a 51%. So that was challenging IQ tests. Is really what it was. Yeah. They were saying that IQ tests are normed on European American populations with norms and cultural factors that cause minorities to do less or not do as well on these. So is it a fair assessment to take a test that's normed on another population is kind of the argument. So bringing that back all to what we're talking about today with the Rooney Rule and the hiring is how much implicit bias exists within these systems.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things as I was looking at this was, back in the 50s and 60s, economists thought that human beings were like rational. Like you and I would be presented with a situation and we would look at that situation and here's the statistical odds that would give us the best outcome for this opportunity, right? Well, there's a lot of research done, and two psychologists in particular, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who looked at, well, is that true? Right? And what they found is that we have these, essentially what they're called is heuristics, and there's different types, but the underlying notion of this is we have to make many decisions throughout a day, right? Especially as therapists. We sit in our office, we have people come in and they tell us things for 45 minutes, or we talk, and we have to make decisions that are split second, not really knowing the outcomes. And so we develop these rules of thumb, right? And these rules of thumb are not necessarily conscious, right? But we all have these rules to help make decisions easier. And so as we look at this with the Giants, and that's where the bias may be created, is we have these rule of thumb that you're talking about, which it may be an unspoken one, but it might be a rule of thumb that when I see somebody who looks a specific way, a specific skin tone, that it helps me make the decision.
And that's how
easier.
The brain, from a psychological angle, we like patterns, we like those kind of things. So it's if we can put things, predictability. So it's the same thing. Trayvon Martin, hoodie, all those different things. Not to get sidetracked on that, but it's all a part of the same concept of implicit bias. It exists. It's real. It's all of us. It doesn't mean you're racist. It just means you have to be aware of it and try to acknowledge it, and then try to work towards challenging that whenever you're feeling a certain way. We follow intuition a lot, and that's good. But where is that intuition guided?
Right. And I was listening to Bomani Jones, and he made a really interesting point that I thought was very accurate. Is he essentially said that this is not going to change until we allow ourselves to, maybe not intentionally, but to have people's feelings get hurt, right? Particularly white people, of like, when somebody points out something that you don't do intentionally, that can be jarring. It can be hurtful, but we need to start having those conversations so that when we are blind to our own biases, they start to get pointed out to enact some of that change.
See, that's interesting because maybe just from my own personal angle, I think about like being challenged on something that I'm not doing intentionally. I'd welcome that personally. But that's a part of our individual growth and evolution is, are you open to constructive criticism? Like I welcome it because I'm a growth oriented individual. So for me, I wouldn't, again, if you associate it with racism, are you calling me racist? Then yes. Right. But that's what you're projecting onto that example. If someone's just trying to help you see something that you may not see, I'm open to that. So anything else about the Giants specifically, their hire? What are your personal opinion? What's your personal opinion about the hire?
About the hire, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It seems reactionary in nature, and so, I think there's a bigger issue within that context that we need to address. So, I'm not a Giants fan, thank God, but it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, I feel similarly. There are more qualified minority and other coaches out there. I was surprised by that hire because this wide receivers coach who's only been a wide receivers coach for 1 year with Bill Belichick and not a solid wide receiving core at best, and his previous experience has been as a special teams coordinator. So now you're giving him the keys to the car and saying, hey, you're going to run this organization with this quarterback. And then I heard something about Garrett from the Cowboys potentially coming on as Jason Garrett coming on as a coordinator. So maybe they're trying to put some pieces around him. But again, maybe they know something we don't. But one other angle before we shift into World War III, which may be the end. Neither here nor there. But one more angle is... When you think about, I think I just lost it. I got caught up with World War III and then I just lost it.
Well, I want to, it was interesting. I'll kind of jump in with what you're talking about Jason Garrett and the Cowboys. It was interesting because when Jerry Jones hired Mike McCarthy, they also interviewed Marvin Lewis, who was a former
Cincinnati Bengals head coach.
Cincinnati Bengals head coach. And he's come out and essentially said, like, they interviewed me. But there was no indication that they were doing it for any other reason than to fulfill the rule.
No, good point.
And so I think that's a really interesting part of it is like, is it just going through the motions?
Yeah, for sure. So let's shift to, I lost my thought. Sorry, guys. We'll get it later. Oh, well, happens. It comes with age. So let's shift to World War III, which it's funny because that's a thing that's just been spewing through social media, but the reality is there is no data that supports there's a potential World War III.
Not at all.
Like it's just there's a disagreement with Iran, and again we're not the news, so we're not here to just highlight what's going on.
Right.
But it's more the psychological angle and how our society has shifted, specifically the populations that we work with, and how they're processing these potential situations and the fears and anxieties and worries about potential war. Right. But from my understanding, from what I saw last night on the news, and I've been trying to keep up with it, they're coming to a resolution. There's no more bombing occurring as of now. Yeah. So, what are your thoughts? What are you seeing on social media from clients?
And one of the reasons I had this conversation earlier this week. So one of the reasons I want to talk about it was, the topic came up, and the first reaction was, I've got this great meme to explain it, like how I feel about it. And you and I are sitting here talking about World War III, but laughing at the same time. And I think that's a really interesting part of it is that because some of the memes going back to the Golden Globes are based in humor, right? Of where is that, benign part of it and where's the reality of it. And so what I've noticed though is at times that young people in particular are able to explain things that might be a little bit more complex, whether it's introspective or external, just through memes. I've had people show me a picture of essentially it was like a bunch of spikes around a doorknob, but it was his way of saying like it's difficult for me to open up to people, right?
Spot on.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because we put words to that, but at the time that's the way that he was able to communicate it with me.
Yes. No, I see that a lot with depression specifically. I think there's a whole subculture of dark humor around being depressed, and I have friends that I grew up with that I see on social media, and one in particular that posts like very dark, depressing memes, but it's using humor to cope. So I go back to like from a psychological angle, the defense mechanisms that exist. I think defense mechanisms get a bad rap, so projection or redirection or deflection, whatever it may be, but also humor, right? Humor is a common way in which we cope with things that are too difficult. So at their core, defense mechanisms are protective in nature. Right. So they're meant to only allow for you to process or deal with as much as you can deal with at that time.
Right.
So if you're using humor, that's just where you're at right now. You can't fathom a World War III and your life being in danger and being in a war-torn country. So the way you kind of cope with it for right now is through using, and that's okay, and psychologically and from my personal opinion, that's okay as long as it's not hurting other people.
Yeah, or you.
If that's what's helping you. So again, I share this with clients all the time. Be careful to judge a defense mechanisms as automatically bad or defense mechanism that you may be implementing, because it's helping you cope. It's helping you deal with as much as you can cope with right now. That's what it's meant to do. But over time, you have to challenge it and make sure that you're forcing yourself to deal with the underlying issues. But initially, it's okay to just, as long as it's, again, benign, that's fine.
It's helping the brain process information that might be in its core too difficult at the time, is exactly what you're saying. So it's just allowing the brain's processing systems to do what it does in a way that's that we best know how, right? Like, these kids are growing up with technology at their fingertips. That's how they're raised. They know nothing else. Because really over the last couple years, memes have turned into a form of like really communication for some cultures, but it wasn't always that way. And so it's interesting to see this growth of like the connection that they feel. Right?
No, I absolutely, I can speak for myself. I'm 30 years old, so I'm not that old, but I'm not that young either. But I grew up in this generation to some extent, and I think that helps me do my job because I can connect with other adolescent, young adult guys. But the reality is, I have a friend of mine who's back home in Florida who I grew up with. Our communication is almost solely through Instagram DM meme sharing. Like there's nothing else. Like, we may check in, hey, I'm going to be in Florida this week. But outside of that, it's just memes back and forth. And it's not always dark. It's sometimes sports related, like the Kevin Durant situation yesterday, which is a whole other story. But it's all sending memes back and forth. And I think that's healthy. I think too often technology, social media, memes get a bad rap because we make this association about, oh my, this is unhealthy, and yes, it can be. I do not want to minimize 100%. That, and technology addiction is a real thing and all of those. But if it's not at that threshold of an addiction or a problem or misuse or trolling behavior, which occurs as well, it can be a way to connect and strengthen relationships. And we talk about from a social skills perspective and the research on developing relationships. It's multiple touch points. So if you and I are friends at work, but we also send memes back and forth, that's another touch point. And if we hang out and watch the game together, that's another. So that's going to help strengthen bonds and relationships.
Absolutely.
So that's I'm really an advocate for, if you're doing it right, it's okay. Humor, memes, all of those things, as long as you're not, hurting anybody.
I mean, I take that approach. I mean, if you're going to communicate with me in a meme or not at all, like, show me the meme. Right? Like, if a kid can tell me that he's depressed through a meme, show me that. But it's right. They don't have to be mutually exclusive that they're bad. There's definitely some give and take.
So let's bring it back to related to specifically the World War III scenario. And like, so when you were saying, because it was an influx of World War III memes. And then, so just I'll share with you my opinion, but what was your personal experience with just seeing all those? Like, was it positive? Were you able to laugh, or were you like, oh no, this is too serious to laugh at? Like, what was
my personal reaction? My personal reaction was almost like, yeah, this is funny, but there's a little bit of truth that could be that could be uncomfortable. And so I found myself being able to laugh at it, but also on the back end following the news, like monitoring the situation. And so, because I found a lot of it was from, we talk about cognitive distortions a lot in the ways that we kind of distort reality, and one of them is called catastrophizing, right? Where we just, the worst case scenario. And so what happened, the ones that I saw were like, this is a worst case scenario, which is normal with some of that reaction. So it was important for me to take a step back and be like, all right, how much of this catastrophizing is true and how much is just a distortion? So that was my reaction. Found most of them pretty funny, though.
So my gut reaction when I first started seeing them was, it's like, oh, I shouldn't be laughing at this, but this is hilarious. And there were some benign videos of like, cartoon characters dancing, and it was like, me and my boys meet up at World War III, and it's like, it's innocent, but I found myself laughing really hard and thinking back to like when I was in high school and in college, and Twitter was really booming, and I know Twitter's still there, but I've kind of moved away from that personally. But Twitter, and I remember whenever an event was going on, an awards show, and people were just tweeting, and it was just like, you felt like you get this high from just like being a part of seeing all this. But to me, I think why I love social media memes is just the creativity that it allows. So the creativity, the fact that someone can take something so dark and make it positive. And that's a lot of what we do in our office is, we hear a lot of heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And we don't minimize it by any means.
Right.
But if you can see someone turn that negative and perspective is reality, and we know the power of that from cognitive behavioral therapy, and if you can change your cognitions, you can change your experience.
Right.
So to me, it's like, again, as long as you're still dealing with the underlying issues, my take initially, but I had this, that was my take initially, right? Secondarily, I was like, when I started watching the news and seeing more of the reality, and then Trump tweeting and threatening, I'm like, oh, this can get really real. And then it was like, should I be laughing at this? And then there were other memes and videos that came out from individuals that were overseas saying, hey, these are funny, but like, why don't you guys spend some time praying for us as opposed to just laughing at what could happen, which kind of challenged me to kind of take a different stance. It was like, no, that's very valid, because there are and then we're here in North Carolina, Fort Bragg, there were like 7,000 soldiers that were sent, and you saw videos of them in the airport. So it's like, this is real. People and this is life or death.
Right.
So then it's, the reality, and then it's like dealing with the underlying. But I still don't, I guess the best word, and not necessarily the ideal word, is like, I don't regret laughing, because it's not anything bad in and of itself. It's just, when you see the bigger picture, you're able to be able to sympathize or empathize with both sides of it. Hey, we can laugh because there's nothing we can do about it.
Right.
So what am I going to do unless I'm going to join this service?
Yep.
So again, I see both sides.
It's that balance that you're talking about, right?
For
Striking that balance. So
for sure. So anything else before we wrap it up? We've kind of hit our three major topics today. Do we have any questions from viewers or anything of that sort, Mr. Brandon?
Yeah, you kind of touched on it, but Janie said that it's hard not to laugh at the memes and situations, but at the same time, it makes them feel guilty. So the question was, do you not find it disturbing that so many people are using humor to cope?
It's a good question. I think from that angle, if everyone was just using humor and not actually dealing with it, then absolutely, if us as a society is just laughing at it, it's like, oh my God, look at what Trump is tweeting, and he's just triggering them and pushing them, and then it causes more issues. Or if we're not dealing with the underlying, if you really do have some fears, then kind of taking some time to sit with those and kind of cope with those. But I think as parents or as individuals that are engaged with other individuals who may be feeling different emotions, it's having these conversations about what's right and what's wrong. You know? Because I think about depression also. That's what comes to mind, because guilt, people don't often think about guilt associated with depression. People just think sadness, but guilt is a criteria for depression. Absolutely. So if it's unrealistic, catastrophizing or catastrophic thinking, right, about like, oh my, like why should I shouldn't be laughing at this, what's wrong with me? Like, no, understanding that you're human, I think, is a big part of it. Understanding that hypocrisy exists within all of us. But it's all about acknowledging, addressing, and moving forward with it. But very valid points. I think if all we're doing is humor, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that humor is good and just using it just as to cope all the time and never really dealing with underlying issues is good. Too much of a good thing is bad, right? So that's it's really, are you able to laugh, and are you able to kind of deal with the underlying issues? Absolutely. Anything else you would add to that?
No, I mean, you've touched on it, and going forward, it's that, and you had mentioned it's all about perspective too. Like, I mean, I don't have any, family members or anything like that are stationed or in Fort Bragg or anything. So, but you had said it earlier, like, if I'm doing or saying something that I'm not aware of and somebody challenges me, so I think that's even that in that question is a good challenge of like, are we using humor too much? And I think as we look at the different perspectives, it can challenge us, and that's where those are so important, is to say, okay, well, am I using humor too much, right? Am I getting carried away with this?
And that was exactly what happened for me. I think I was laughing, and I had this underlying feeling like, oh, this feels kind of guilt. Like this doesn't feel right. But then when I saw that video of that young man that was overseas and talking about, hey guys, this is funny, I can relate. Right. But at the same time, like, pray for us. Like, this is life or death for us. So I think, again, good challenges, and thank you for your comments and questions. Well, that wraps it up for us here today in the Shrink Tank Live morning show. From Charlotte, North Carolina, this is Tarik Sloussi.
I'm Ian Murray. We appreciate you being with us, and we hope you enjoyed as much as we did.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.